we're basically looking at three facets to the injury prevention. The first is mobility development and joint conditioning. So that's about building functional flexibility and resilience in our joints so that we can prevent really bad injuries from happening if we do have an injury. That way, instead of breaking a bone or dislocating a joint, we're actually able to bounce back from these kind of injuries a little bit easier than if we're deconditioned and our joints are not able to adapt. So that's kind of the first stage. The second part of injury prevention is improving our balance and our proprioception and our ability to move. So that's really just about how well we can prevent the loss of balance and the fall in the first place. So this is really balancing walking and changing levels while balancing and changing directions when balancing. So this builds our proprioception, which is our ability to kind of perceive where our body is in relation to the world around us. So we want to have this sense of body awareness that grows with different kinds of movements that we engage in. So when we do certain movements, we're able to kind of better control our body and better be aware of what's happening in our body. So when we lose balance and we start to fall, we can catch ourselves a little bit sooner and maybe have a little more range of motion on the way down so that we can lower ourselves down instead of falling from quite so high. The next level in injury prevention is the actual falling skills. So the skills of injury prevention or the skills of ukemi are break falls and rolls and also a little bit of jumping on flat ground. So the idea here is to be comfortable and to cultivate our relationship with gravity and with the ground. We want to be able to adapt and to receive the ground rather than fighting against it. So what I mean by cultivating our relationship with gravity and our relationship with the ground is being familiar with it and seeing it as something that's going to catch you or embrace you when you fall, rather than something that you have to fight against and resist as you fall. If you're comfortable with falling skills, then you're not worried about hurting yourself when you have a fall, because it's a movement and a pattern that you've practiced on many different textured surfaces if you're adept and you've been practicing for a while. And you're comfortable transitioning between standing and lying down, whether all at once and all of a sudden or slowly and in a controlled manner. And the way that we train is to progress from that slow and controlled manner to being able to do it with a little more of a realistic speed. When it comes to developing these aspects of injury prevention, they kind of bleed into one another a little bit. And what that means is that I'm categorizing these in this way, but they're not separate in these elements, right? These are all things, though you'll find elements of mobility development and joint resilience in the safe falling stuff and in the proprioception training stuff. And the same is true for all these other sections. This is just how I've divided it. And the other side of this as well is we're also thinking about how do we address healing and recovering from minor injuries, because we're learning how to prevent injuries, but that doesn't mean that we're going to be invincible, right? You might have a minor injury from an accident that might have caused a major injury. And even a minor injury like a small sprain or something like that, the better we are at doing the things that help to remedy the problem, the better that we can facilitate our recovery and get back to a place where our body is in a state to be able to adapt to different circumstances. So a good example for this that I'll talk about a little bit later is an injury I had about a month ago. Actually, it was 4 weeks ago tonight, probably 20 minutes from before we finish this. In the middle of this live stream will be 4 weeks exactly from the moment that I injured myself. And what happened was I sprained my leg. So I was doing some tic tacs, wall jumps, and I had a poor foot placement in one of the jumps. And as I put pressure on my leg, the fibula, this second bone, there's the uh, tibia and the fibula off to the side. Actually, I felt it stretch, and I looked down and I saw it extending out and coming and protruding as I put weight on it. And then I felt all the muscles in my leg just pull it back in and start spasming for the next 25 minutes. And I went to the ground, put it up, and then I started assessing it and doing things for it. And I am really, really lucky that it wasn't a worse injury than it could have been. It didn't bruise up, it didn't get swollen, it never stayed dislocated. It was pulled back in. So, and I didn't really necessarily have pain in it. There was just a tightness and a discomfort when I walk on it and bend it. Um, and so this first 3 weeks of this recovery process was really just all about resting it and trying to stay within the range of motion that doesn't cause any discomfort or tightness, and then also working on it using self-treatment methods like self-shiatsu and sotai and things like that. So I've really put in a lot of work over that first 3 weeks, which is the time when scar tissue settles in and is built to kind of replace any of the damaged tissue. So any if I had any tears in any ligaments or tendons or anything like that, after the 3 weeks, they're all kind of patched up, and that tissue is not the best. And I'm restricting my range of motion to prevent the ligaments and tendons from healing back too long, which will make it difficult for the joint to stabilize. I don't want it to be too flexible when I'm dealing with um, ligaments, especially. So uh, after 3 weeks, I felt a little, I felt an improvement every single day. And then within the last week, uh, I've actually had a few little breakthroughs with movement. I've started to integrate some mobility training and stuff like that. And then getting out of the self-treatment healing phase and kind of in the common space in the Venn diagram of injury prevention and mobility stuff and the self-healing stuff. So now over the next 2 weeks or so, I'm expecting to see a lot of this improvement. I believe that improvements in the body or changes in the body, significant changes in the body occur every 3 weeks or so, or it takes 3 weeks or so for a big change to kind of settle in. And you see that reflected in how long it takes for scar tissue to lay down in sprains and things like that. So the next 3 weeks is really all about reestablishing range of motion, releasing any excess tension that was kind of untouchable before. And then after that, I'm expecting to have my full range of motion back. So every day I have more and more range of motion. I wasn't able to cross my legs like this yesterday, and there's no discomfort when I'm doing it. So I feel pretty good with that. I'm not at a point where I can sit seiza or in a kneeling position just yet, but I'm getting there. So it's really interesting for me in my profession to be observing this healing process and to observe how my body responded to that injury that happened. Um, if my muscles were too tight and not responsive enough in allowing this to extend out, if this bone couldn't have come out a little bit, then it could have been a break in that. If that much pressure was going in and it wasn't allowed to move, I could have broken my fibula. If if it was too loose and there wasn't enough, or my muscles weren't responsive enough to pull that back in at that last second, then it could have dislocated completely and really overstretched some ligaments even more than what's been done already. So the fact that my muscles were able to respond and pull it back in is again a sign of how the work that I do with my mobility and taking care of my joints has been paying off, right? I'm seeing the results of my own ongoing injury prevention, because if I haven't been doing all the mobility work that I do in my own injury prevention practice, I wouldn't, my body wouldn't have been able to respond to it like that. I wouldn't have been able, without the proprioception that I build through that stage of injury prevention, proprioception, I was able to feel this as it was happening. I was able to look down and see it, and I was able to stop putting pressure on it and just drop off the wall into almost a rolling break fall position, and not touch my leg to anything else on the way down. So as soon as I felt it, I was off it. And part of that is the actual break fall training, being comfortable just going from standing, or in this case jumping off a wall, to directly down into a break fall on the ground, and to be able to do it in that moment where I'm feeling that happen was definitely something that that I feel I've benefited from when it comes to the things that I do in my own practice. So I think that the response and the quick healing process for this, considering this could have been a much worse injury, is a really good testament to the work that I've been doing personally. And so, and I think each one of those facets or elements of injury prevention that I outlined earlier are the things that, the ingredients that really created this condition for me to be able to respond without making this worse than it is. And that's often what's going to happen when we're talking about injury prevention. It's not like when you learn to break fall and all this kind of stuff, you're invincible and you'll never hurt yourself when you fall. You might hurt yourself when you fall. You might fall because you just hurt yourself, but that is a safety. I fell and rolled to the ground because that's my safe. I feel safe there. That's my safe space. I'm completely comfortable. I'm not worried about what's going to happen if I roll down to the ground, and I know I can keep my weight off my leg if I go into that pattern. So it's a natural response for me. It's not something I had to think about. It just happened, and me explaining it isn't the process of me deciding to do it and doing those movements in the moment. It's my reflection of what has happened, and feeling what I've been going through. So, returning to the elements or facets of our injury prevention stuff, the mobility and joint integrity work is really important. I think that stuff is where everything starts, and that's something that we should be doing every day. And what is really important for this one is our ankles and feet. So mobility in our ankles and feet, mobility in our hips, our ability to segment our hip movement, which is the ball and socket joint, from our lower back movement, which would be the hips and lower back joints. So people think the hips, and they're often thinking about bending at the waist, but the waist is the upper part of the hips. This is where the top of your hip bones connect with your spine, right? So your lumbar spine emerges from this part, and that's not what we're trying to bend when we're sitting. So if you're sitting on the ground and you're curled back like this, your lower back is compensating for the lack of the ability for the ball and socket joint, where your femur or your thigh bone connects into your hip, for it to be able to articulate. So you should be able to keep your back in that isolated same position and just hinge at that ball and socket joint. And the key to doing that, really, there's a lot of sitting on the ground movements that are going to help a lot. Some of the key ones are three big ones. This is a big one. They call this cobbler pose or open bend sit in MoveNat. And you can do some kind of a stretch in this position. You can rock in this position. You can do all kinds of movements from here to kind of open up the hips here. You can also change positions of your legs. These are all transitions that are variations of this position. Another position that's important is with your feet forward. So we're not really talking too much about how to do these movements and everything, but ideally, if you're feeling like you're being pulled back in any of these positions, putting a pillow under your hips will help a lot because your feet will be lower than your hips. So gravity is going to help you a little bit more to hinge over. But the point here is to be able to, in this position, hinge at my hip and see how much of that I can get. I don't want to try to reach as far as I can because I'm just going to use my back to do that. And even if I am trying to do that, if I hinge at my hips as far as I can first and then round my back, I'll get a lot farther than if I just round my back. Because if I round my back, I'm not going to be able to hinge at the hips at the end of that. So hinging, starting the movement from the lowest point first, and then almost like a little wave, letting the rest of the movement come through the body is the best way to do these kind of stretches if you're trying to do full reach and let your head relax and everything. But the most important thing when it comes to hip mobility is just creating these little movements, right? You can also do a little bit of butt walking or just trying to alternate which foot is reaching out furthest. So I got my feet out here and I'm reaching out one at a time. So those are some things that can articulate that position. And the other important position is legs open, knees apart, and either hinging at the hips or hinging sideways or rotating around. We do these movements in meridian stretching. We do them in a lot of other practices as well. These are all move-nat sitting positions. So it's in that practice also. But again, you're going to want to make sure that you're hinging at that ball and socket joint and not with your lower back. The last thing is something I can't really do, which is right now because of my leg injury, which is sitting in that kneeling position and laying back. But I'll show you the variation, which is if you're tight sitting in that position, this is going to be what you're going to want to do. And that's just sticking out one leg in front of you, bringing the other leg behind you. So what I can do is get on my elbow, grab that leg. If you can't reach, you can get a towel around your leg, sling it around, and use that to pull your leg back. But all you're trying to do is put your leg on the ground, and then you can just hang out here. Think about pressing your hip forward. I can also lay down here to intensify it if it's easy for you. And then this side, this leg's kind of tight, so this is a lot further than I could do yesterday, so that's really awesome. But there we go. I'm just trying to tuck the top of it. I don't want it sitting out to the side like this. I want it on the top. And then either elbow, hand, or laying all the way back. I can lay on my side like this or all the way back to get into this kind of position. But the important thing is the kneeling position. Those are some movements that you can do to work your way up to that, to being able to do that. So hips are really important. I think those 4 stretching categories are what's really important when it comes to establishing that hip mobility and establishing the ability to, because really what it comes down to is how much can you hinge from your hip and how much can you segment that from the movement of your lower back. So if you can control that, you're good. And other than that, with the lower body, ankles and feet are really important. If you're taking care of your ankles and feet and you're taking care of your hips, everything in between is probably going to fall into suit. Unless you've got some real long-term issues, then you might have to focus a little bit on knee mobility and stuff like that. Maybe stretching out your calves a little bit. So next, we're working our way up. We're looking at we're not really going to focus too much on spinal mobility because it's really more about separating it from the movement of our girdles, right? So we got our pelvic girdle, which is girdles are just areas where our trunk splits off into other segments. So our pelvic girdle is where our trunk splits off into each leg. And our shoulder girdle or our pectoral girdle is where our trunk splits off into two arms, and then the rest of the trunk continues into the head. So these are major bottlenecks for tension, and being able to segment the girdle from the trunk, which is what we talked about with the hips and what we'll talk about with the shoulders, is a really big deal. And if you can do that, I don't think you have to focus too much on spinal flexibility or mobility or anything like that, because a lot of it is just coming from uncoupling these other joints. So when we're looking at shoulder mobility, we're trying to improve our ability to bring our arms up overhead. So if I can bring my arms up to my ear level without jutting my head forward and without sticking my ribs out, then I am in a pretty good place for shoulder mobility, right? If I get to about here and then I do this, I'm using my spine to compensate for my lack of shoulder mobility. Because if I straighten my spine back up, you can see that my arms are not upright. And if I'm getting a barbell and pushing it up overhead without that ability to separate this rib thrust from my extension, that's going to cause a lot of problems, build up a lot of tension in the shoulders, build up a lot of tension in the spine, the neck. Everything is going to be not as good as it could be if you had better shoulder mobility. The best thing for that is hanging. There's nothing that can replace what hanging can do for you. What I mean by that is just hanging from your hands from a bar or a tree branch or the edge of a stair at your house, or whatever you can find. It's not easy. It's not hard to set something up like that, and you can easily find a bar for pull-ups that fits in your door frame or something for like $20 at any superstore or whatever. So set something up. You don't have to have your feet off the ground. You just need to hang. You can have your feet on the ground and pretend you're sitting in an invisible chair. But that decompression of your spine, that basically that hanging actually creates almost an extra joint in your shoulder. So we didn't really know this until about a decade ago, but there's the third joint of the shoulder. And this third joint is called the acromio-humeral joint. And it's a part-time joint. This acromial is the acromion process. And this is your collarbone. So my collarbone extends out, and at the end of the collarbone, I have the tip of the collarbone, which is the acromion process. And it's just kind of hanging out here, and it connects to the deltoid muscles, and the whole arm is kind of hanging off of this acromion process. And if we never hang, just the weight of this arm and all the stuff we do with our hands in front of us pulls on the end of this bone, and the ligaments between that connect this bone to the humerus and everything start to tense up as well. And what happens is this creates piezoelectricity, which is the form of kind of energy that tells bone cells to change shape. So if you're not hanging, what happens is this acromion process starts to curve down with the weight of the arm over time. And then the space underneath for things to get through becomes restricted. And this is where we can get nerve impingement and all kinds of problems that people would normally go to a surgeon to get fixed. And there is a famous shoulder surgeon in the United States called Dr. John Kirsch, who did a whole study with people who are awaiting shoulder surgery, and he put them through his hanging regimen, which involved hanging 3 times a week for a few minutes, and then after that doing some lightweight lifting in 3 directions 3 times a week. And the hanging routine was 10 minutes, set a timer for 10 minutes, hang as long as you can, leave the timer going, come down when you're tired, take a 1-minute break, get back up there, hang as long as you can. Try to hang for at least 30 seconds. So if you can't hang for 30 seconds with your feet off the ground, make sure you've got your feet on the ground. And After this, most of the people, it was 95% of the people who in the study did not need surgery afterwards. And it was only people with a full width tear of their rotator cuff. So the rotator cuff muscle was completely disconnected. Those were the only people that needed surgery ultimately. Everything else was able to be recovered with the hanging routine. And what's interesting is he ended up later on incurring a shoulder injury when he got kind of run over by some big dogs at a dog park or something like that. And it actually involved a full width tear of his rotator cuff. So one of his rotator cuff muscles is not even connected. And he did his hanging routine, and even though he had pain, what he found was that even when there's pain with hanging, uh, it doesn't make the problem any worse, and it actually improves the situation. So even though it was hurting, even though he couldn't actually lift his arm, he could put his arm up, do his hanging, and then the best he could do his weights, and he actually regained. Now I think he's in his 70s now, and he still does his routine probably every day, and he has full range of motion, no pain, no discomfort in his shoulders, and he's missing a muscle. So that's pretty remarkable. Even though his study showed that people with a full width tear did need surgery, he was able to navigate his full width tear of his rotator cuff muscle and regain all of his function and no pain at an advanced age using his routine. So hanging, really great. You don't have to do his full routine, especially if you don't have problems. If you do have a problem, I had a shoulder problem, a few AC joint sprains, and I had numbness in my arms all the time. It woke me up in the middle of the night. I struggled with that for years. I went to see an acupuncturist. That helped quite a bit, but I was still having the problems until I started doing John Kirsch's hanging routine. It started to help a little bit and feel a little bit better within a short time of taking it up. But after, I think it was about 8 months of me doing this consistently, I found that my shoulder pain, my numbness was completely gone, and I didn't have to do the hanging regimen every day. Now I just do 1 or 2 1-minute hangs every day just to stretch everything out, once in the morning and maybe once in the afternoon or in the evening. So if you don't have any problems and you want to do this hanging for prevention, or you don't have much range of motion, just doing the hanging for as long as you can is great. Trying to increase how long you can hang in one go is fun too. So I recommend, if you want to challenge yourself with your hanging and you're a pretty fit person, doing it every day for your range of motion, to improve your range of motion, and thinking about, okay, well, I can hang for like 30 seconds before I have no more strength left. I'm going to try to build up to being able to hang for 1 minute, right? And I did this, and I worked my way up to about 2.5 minutes. I think once I did 3 minutes, and it was pretty excruciating. Now I don't really ever do more than 1 minute, but I'm sure I could, because I'm not very tired after the 1 minute hang, and I don't need to adjust my grip with a 1 minute hang either. So it's really fun to challenge yourself to be able to hang longer and to see the progress, because you do see the progress and you see your calluses kind of build up in a nice way. And you feel your grip strength improving, and you see the strength in your arms start to change as well. So it's really cool. You get a lot of benefits from hanging, and that's what really opens up the shoulders a lot. So another thing to think about is, while you're doing that hang, I mean, there's technical things where we can work on, because what's going to happen is, if you do have that coupling of the rib thrust and the shoulder issue, what's going to happen is you're going to be hanging and you're going to be thrusting your rib out, or you're going to be sticking your head out. So making sure that you've got your ears in line with your shoulders and that your ribs are not sticking out. So if I think about the end of my ribs, the furthest part I can touch, and the furthest part of my. Oh, sorry about that. I think we just had a hiccup there. So, what I was saying was with the arms up overhead and in the hanging position, you want to have your ears in line with your arms. So if someone's looking at you from the side, they're not seeing your ears, and you want to have your ribs in line with your hips. So if my ribs are sticking out in front of my hips, if I got my thumb on my hip on my ribs and my middle finger on my hips, they should be flush. So they should be in line. If my ribs are sticking out in front of them, then they're not in line. So one thing you can do if you don't have the proprioception to feel whether you're doing that or not is you can set up a camera next to where you're hanging from and just take a quick video and then look at your own position and see where everything is. But that's the most important thing about our shoulder mobility. So getting the shoulder girdle to uncouple with the thoracic spine so that you can move your arms into their full range of motion without compensating with your torso. So we look at mostly how we can control and improve our mobility in the shoulders, how we can improve that motion of the ball and socket joint of the hips and our ability to hinge, and then we look at our feet and ankles and our wrists and hands. So everything else, unless you have a problem, it's going to fall into place when you mobilize the rest of those things, in my opinion. And when you're doing other natural movement stuff, it all gets stimulated all the same way. So when we're looking at wrists, this is really important because when you put your hand on the ground to support yourself, if you don't have the range of motion to get your hand in that position without pushing it, then you're going to get some compression and some stress in your wrist. So if you're doing like yoga or something like that, and you're getting into some kind of a movement or whatever, where you're loading your shoulders in front of your hands, like this, really anything further than what I can actively hold is going to put some stress on those joints, right? So what we want to do is improve our ability to basically extend our wrist back like this. And we can do stretches, which are really helpful, and we can do a lot of ground movement transitions, which we kind of talk about in the next section of our injury prevention stuff. But for wrists, we look at mainly at wrist stretches, simple wrist stretches. I'm not going to go in detail of them, but I'll show you all of the basic ones just real quick. We want to do a little bit of extension, so extending out like this. We want to do a little bit of flexion, so pulling back this way. We can do the same thing with our thumb, same with extension. We can do a little bit of a rotation or a twist with the hand, and the same thing in the other direction. I have multiple videos going over all of these, so just check my channel if you want a follow along for this. So 1, 2, that's flexion and rotation. So those are the key, and then you can do your thumb as well. If you're doing a lot of phone stuff and your thumbs are sore, or you hold your hand out and your thumb's not hanging out like this, it's stuck in here like this, then this is going to be a really good stretch for you to do throughout the day. So I'll show you this one. I'm looking at my palm and I'm putting my hand behind my other hand. I'm just taking my fingers and I'm wrapping them behind my thumb. So from here, I'm just going to make this arm heavy and I'm going to extend this arm out. So this arm sticks out, palm up, this arm gets heavy, and I'm just letting this hand hang off of the thumb. From there, I take this hand and I move it, flex and extend as I hang off with the other one. And then my thumb rotates in this extended position and I can really get some good decompression out of it. So in my shiatsu practice, I'm always pressing. Plus, I got to do a lot of social media stuff. So this stretch is something I live by multiple times a day. Sometimes in the middle of a treatment, I'll just whip this out, do a quick couple of these, and then get right back to it. I can get a nice decompression. If I ever want to pop my thumb or crack my thumb, I'll start with some of this to loosen it up, and then nice little pull. All right, so those are wrist stretches. I recommend wrist stretches before any activity that you're going to be putting pressure on your hands. It's going to get your hand ready, but there's other things we can do in those wrist stretch positions. So just passive stretches like this aren't necessarily the best thing for improving our range of motion. It's kind of a good warm up, but what's better is if you can let go, if you can control this range. So I'm here in this passive stretch, and I'm going to start using this hand to start holding itself as far into this position as I can. And then I'm going to let go of this hand slowly. And this is in functional range conditioning. This is called the passive range hold. So I'm getting into my passive range, and then I'm holding it there, and then I'm letting go slowly. And then slowly this hand moves into that active range. But I'm able to control more than my active range a little bit in there. So doing little things like that can help a lot. Also pressing against your pressure. So we'll say with this stretch, I'm pushing here, and this is my stretch. But what I'm going to do with this hand, I'm going to push back, and I'm going to resist a little bit with this hand. And then I'm going to reset, and then again pushing. So I'm getting into this passive range, and then I'm actively pressing or actively pulling so that I can train that range that I don't normally have active control within. So this is what mobility training is all about, is taking the passive range of motion where you don't have any control and you don't have any strength, and building strength in that end range. So normally you have a little like range of motion sandwich going on with all of your joints. The bread of the sandwich is your passive range of motion. So it's far at the end of your range. So one of the slices of bread of my sandwich is being in this position. One of the slices of my bread in my sandwich is being in this position, and then my meat of my sandwich is this range of motion. So I can't get into this range without help from this hand. So that's my slice of bread. That's my sandwich meat. That's my other slice of bread. So mobility training is all about how much of that bread can we turn into sandwich meat. So I can press into this range, and then can I control that range? Not for long, it's going to sink back into my active range, but I'm starting to build the neural pathways to control that range of motion. And it's in that slice of bread where injuries happen, because we don't have control in those ranges. I don't think we get injuries in our sandwich meat part of our range of motion. So the more we can expand the sandwich meat part of our range of motion into the bread slices and use thin little slices of bread instead of big thick bagels, we can lessen the range at which we're more susceptible to injuries. So that's where that's where mobility and joint conditioning and joint resiliency training works into injury prevention. And when we're looking at ankles, it's the same thing. So we've got our stretches, right? Flexion, rotation, right? And we can also move it in circles. You can do the same thing with the wrist as well. We can, again, same idea. This is a passive range. I can hold it there, or I can push against my pressure. Same thing here. And with these kind of passive rotations, they can be passive. And if it's passive, I'm really trying to let this whole leg be just dead weight. I don't want it helping or jumping in or doing any of it shouldn't be doing autopilot when I let go of it. It should be all this hand doing the work. And what I should do is I should tune in and I should feel when there's some kind of automatic movement that's happening without me wanting to be there. So there might be certain ranges of motion where there's an active resistance from my joint, and there will be parts of the range of motion where there's a bit of difficulty in allowing the movement to be smooth, like a little bit of a stuttering. So all of the muscles that are creating those movements are voluntary muscles, but we have programmed them to have these weird aberrant reactions. And it's just our movement habits and conditions that we live in that create those aberrant patterns. So by moving slowly through these ranges of motion and taking note where those aberrations are and tuning in and taking back our control of those muscles and those patterns can really help to kind of take those ranges of motion that would be freaking out when we get into them and creating an injury, and making them more familiar, making them stronger, and making them, again, more familiar with the extent of their range of motion. Because that outer edge, that slice of bread part of your range of motion is not a part of your body that you can really sustain a lot of force through, right? And we want to close that gap as much as possible. So this is also something that we should do. It's important to do this passively and to feel those areas that don't have that kind of passive control. And it's also important to do this actively as well. So I'm slowly moving in my range of motion, but I'm not using assistance from my hand. I'm only going to be able to move within my active range of motion, so it's going to be slightly smaller circle than when my hand's helping, but I'm going to feel where I don't have as much active control. There'll be segments where I can't go slow or where the movement is kind of jumpy, and those are the areas where I really need to kind of smoothen out and familiarize myself with. So ankle is a big issue with injury. With my leg injury, with my fibula injury, that foot placement was the reason why all this happened. That's all related to what's going on in my ankles. So this, and that's the other side of that bone. So really, if something's going on in your knee, it's probably related to your ankles. And on the other side, it's probably related to your hips. So to recap, we're really concerned with our foot and ankle mobility, our hip hinging ability, and our mobility of the ball and socket joint, and our ability to extend our arms up overhead without over engaging our torso or our neck. And that's just the mobility part of injury prevention. Most injury prevention systems really just focus on that. And then maybe some of them focus on preventing the slip or preventing the fall, which is kind of the next segment where we're really looking at our proprioception, which is really a nice way of saying our body awareness and our spatial awareness. So our proprioception is how we're conscious of where our bodies are in our environment. So part of my proprioception is knowing when my foot is going to touch the ground, right? That's proprioception and exteroception. So I know where my foot is. I know where it is. I can imagine where it is, and I know where the ground is, and I know when I put my foot down where about it's going to land. And if you try that with your eyes closed or whatever, you'll probably find that the ground comes a little bit before or a little bit after where you were expecting it to touch, right? Nobody's proprioception is perfect, and our proprioception also is enhanced by our visual input, our hearing and all of our other senses. So like moving my foot around, and even my nose maybe knows where my foot is. But the idea with this in the context of injury prevention is really developing how our body can be aware of itself in positions like standing is really important. So my proprioception with standing can be, well, where's my center of gravity, right? Where's my weight distribution in my feet, right? Is it evenly balanced, or is it more on my heel, or is it more on my toe? Where's my weight shifted? Am I shifted on one leg? Am I shifted forward? Is it shifting back? Am I hunched over a little bit? It might be super subtle, like this is a hunched over posture, but it might look regular and upright for most people. So those are all things that we have to think about when we're just talking about standing. And then when we start playing with shifting our body weight, we're kind of getting used to, okay, well, where's my weight distribution changing as I'm making this movement? Can I shift my hips without changing the distribution of weight between my feet? Yeah, I can if I lean my body in the opposite direction. So this is all just building our awareness of our body. And then the important part and the more fun part, I think, for proprioception training is getting into balancing. And you can get a 2x4 piece of wood at the hardware store for a couple of bucks and just keep that under your couch and slide it out whenever you want to do some balance training. But even you can pick a line on the hardwood floor at your house, or a line in the mat like this, and just try walking in a straight line. Balancing. The slower, the better. Focusing on putting the foot down, shifting the weight. You can even try just balancing on one leg. You can do this backwards, forwards. You can see how you can reach in different directions, what you have to do to counterbalance, what your leg and knee are doing to stabilize as you reach in different directions. Maybe you're reaching your arm as well. This is all developing your proprioception. You can also play with changing your level. So squatting down and then continuing to walk. I can't go as deep on this side. So if you can't bend all the way that far down, doesn't matter. You can still go as low as comfortable. And actually going halfway down is harder than going all the way down if you have the ability to do both. So those kind of movements are really helpful. And we can even get into things like crawling. Crawling is really helpful because this builds our contralateral pattern. So that means my ability to move my left and right bottom and top limb at the same time. So my left leg and my right arm move at the same time, and vice versa. And the reason why we do this is because it triangulates our energy and directs us forward instead of moving us side to side. If I do left leg, left hand, I have to lean all my weight onto the right side to move that, and then lean all my weight on the other side to move that. And then I've got this kind of side to side zigzag pattern going on. And for forward movement, that's pretty wasteful. So why is that relevant is because when we're walking, we're doing that same pattern. Walking is a contralateral pattern. And we build that contralateral ability in our infancy when we start crawling before we start transitioning to the walk. This is building the prerequisites in our neurodevelopmental sequence in order to be able to build what we need to walk. So if we have problems with our walking gait pattern, we're probably going to see a reflection of that in our crawling pattern. So if you crawl around and you feel like, oh yeah, I feel like I don't have a lot of stability to hold myself, or I keep going into an ipsilateral pattern, it's probably exposing some subtleties that you don't see or you're not aware of when you're standing and walking, because there are so many more complexities that we have to deal with when we're standing up. Like even just resisting against gravity is a big deal. So to focus on these smaller points that are more prevalent in crawling can help to build up those kind of patterns. The other thing that's really important in proprioception training, and what really builds the bridge between this and the next skill, is the ability to run off the ground. So one of the things that's missing big time in modern society, getting up and down off the ground. When you look at indigenous cultures, it's I think they did a study where the average person in an indigenous society got up and down off the ground 300 times a day. That's a lot. And what they found in the statistics were that elders, elder people, would get up and down off the ground many times more than the younger people. So 300 times a day was the average, and the elder people were doing quite a bit more than that. So they were taking care of kids, they were doing stuff around the home and supporting the community and everything like that. So there was a lot of up and down, a lot of sitting, while everybody else was out doing more active kind of movements. So getting up and down off the ground is really important. And we should be able to do this even into our old ages. If you look at older generations of some cultures, like, for example, Japan, the younger generation is having a little bit of a hard time being comfortable sitting on the ground. Whereas the older generation would be able to sit in seiza, in the deep kneeling posture, well into their old age. And they get up and down off the ground traditionally every night, because traditionally in that culture you would sleep on a futon on the floor. So it wasn't an option. You were getting up and down off the ground. And then outside of this context of what indigenous people were like, and what other cultures that kind of are good examples to show that we should be able to do this skill even when we're older, we can see that in our society we equate the ability to get up and down off the ground with independence for people who are older. If someone doesn't have the ability to get up off the ground, they need help, right? They need help. So they need supervision, they need somebody to take care of them. But if you can get up and down off the ground, you're an older person, you're good to be independent, and you can do everything you need, and you have your independence. But once you lose that ability, you lose your independence, and you need to rely on other people. And there's a lot of fear to knowing that if you're alone and you fall, you're not going to be able to get back up. So without even the context of falling, we should be practicing getting up and down. So if I'm sitting on the ground here, at first, doesn't really matter what you're doing. So putting this hand down, getting into this crawling position, pushing, walking my hands up, getting up. If you do that 10 times in a row, you're gonna feel a little bit of a breaking of your sweat. Make sure you're doing it on both sides. And that's just one example of a get up. If you're a little more athletic, you can try getting up without your hands. Or you can even try getting up without your knees. Whatever you're comfortable with when it comes to getting up is up to you, right? So whatever technique you want, even if you want to think about just doing it by yourself, whatever you want to do, getting up and down off the ground is the important thing at this level. And so we're looking at balancing and proprioception, getting up and down off the ground, and some ground movements like crawling and little hand transitions. So crawling is something that you'd likely do really only when going up a really steep hill, or briefly when going under something that you need to cross and you can't go over or around. But in most cases, crawling is not something that you're really going to need to do or to spend a lot of time doing. But we can use it as a corrective in order to help correct some of our things in our gait pattern in our walking. And then balancing can fix a lot of the problems in our walking as well. So balancing walk, I think, would be balancing walk, getting up and down off the ground, most important things in this category of movement. And then the next category is break falls and rolls. So this is like what we've all been building up to when it comes to all the other segments of injury prevention. It's really fun, and it can be a really good workout if you're comfortable with the skills and quickly. And really, break falls, rolls, and a little bit of jumping on flat ground or down from a very short height. But that last part isn't particularly necessary. So with break falls, when we're teaching it, we're starting with the break fall positions on the ground. So teaching the back break fall, the side break fall, and the forward break fall positions. And then we start to play with transitioning between them. And then we start playing with bringing them up to different levels. So if I want to do my break fall, I can do it slowly from here, from this inverted crawl position. I'm just going to extend the leg out, lower myself down, let my arms extend out, and get into that position. I can do that a little quicker and get the feeling of the actual feeling of falling without actually having to deal with the impact. So it starts with just getting used to the position on the ground and then moving up to actually falling into that position from a low stance. And then we can do it from more of a squatting position. And then we can work our way up to doing it from a standing position. And when we're doing from a standing position, it's not falling from standing, it's lowering ourselves down into that break fall. And then the same way we build from the ground up with the break falls, we build from the ground up for the rolls. And so we start by just practicing some drills like rocking, which is going to be the beginning of your back roll and the end of your forward roll. So it's really important to be able to do this and to round your back, which is funny because we just talked about how important it is to hinge from the hips and not round your back. But we are not going to take these rules and apply them into everything because our bodies are meant to assume all these different positions depending on what we're doing. We just want to remove habitual patterns and coupling of the joints. So with rocking, we're really trying to round the back. And when we get into our rolls, we can start on the ground and do little drills to kind of start the ability to roll. Or with the forward roll, we can start with simple crawling positions and rolling onto the side, and then gradually work our way up to being able to do this kind of a roll instead of from the side, from diagonal, make it more like a forward roll. So we play with these rolls and break falls in order to build these patterns, but these are the important things that you really have to turn into unconscious competencies. So that's all about how we approach progression. So when we start to learn something, we are incompetent usually. We can't do it. We're not good at it. And we don't know we're not good at it because we've never tried it. But once someone shows it to us and we try it, we learn that we're pretty bad at it. So that's conscious incompetence. We're not competent. We can't do it very well, but we know that we're not able to do it very well. So we can learn from the person who's teaching it. And the next stage of it is conscious competence. We've learned what we need to do in order to do the movement correctly, right? But we have to think about it in order to do it correctly. That's okay for a lot of movements that you're going to do for fun or for like performance or for something like that. But if you're really trying to get adept at something, and with break falls especially, if you're trying to make that a useful skill, because it's only useful when you can use it when you're not expecting it, conscious competence isn't enough. You got to take it to the next level, which is where you approach not mastery, but mastery of your familiarity with the movement. And that was where you can do the movement, you're competent in the movement, and you don't have to think about it. When the need arises, the movement comes out and all the pieces are there and it's correct. And there's no bad habits, there's no major inefficiencies or anything that's going to cause injury or problems. So you have to get your break falls and your rolls to a level of unconscious competence in order for them to really be something that you can undoubtedly rely on when you need it, right? So it's not just necessary to learn these, to come out to a workshop, learn how to do it, try it a few times, get the feel of it, and then that's it, right? No, it's something you have to practice regularly. And it can be a really good warm up, especially if you're getting into MoveNat or getting into any natural movement practice. This can be a good way to warm up the body and get it kind of used to whatever you're going to do. And at the same time, you're building those patterns better and better. So that's our kind of breakdown of the three elements of injury prevention. We're looking at mobility and joint resiliency, uh, proprioceptive training, balance, that kind of development, and then the actual injury prevention skills. We do get into a little bit of jumping. For some people who might be interested, we could get into dive rolls, and we also get into some hand transitions, which are really just if I'm here and I want to move somewhere, that's a hand transition. So it's like a super lazy cartwheel. So those are, again, ways to load the hands, ways to play with body weight transfer, and things like that. So it's injury prevention training is something that should be a part of everybody's practice. If you're doing any other movements, or if you're doing no other movements, it can be a more major part of your practice. But it's something that if you integrate, it's going to benefit you in ways that are going to keep you moving gracefully, comfortably, and being able to sustain in that may cause serious injuries without actually taking on those serious injuries. So I've got some injury prevention videos on my channel. You can check it out. I've also got a members kind of subscribers section on my website at naturalmobility.net. There's a few injury prevention videos, one where I break down the back break fall and the back roll, and one where I kind of introduce the forward and side break falls and the forward roll. That one just released recently. So if you're interested in those, you can check out the website. I usually post a 30-minute class every week or so for that service. And then if you're in Toronto, I'm having an injury prevention extended class on Wednesday, September 13th, 2023. It's at 7 o'clock until 9 o'clock. So we're going to cover those first three segments in the first hour, and then we're going to break down the break, fall, and roll techniques in the second hour of that class. So if you're interested, again, check out my website. All the info is up there. I hope to see you soon.